I never imagined that the greatest betrayal in my marriage would come from the man I trusted most. It was not an affair. It was not gambling, addiction, or some secret second family. In a strange way, what Daniel did felt even worse. Because he looked me in the eyes every day, talked about our future, and watched me sacrifice for a dream he had already decided to destroy. My husband secretly gave our entire life savings to his mother. And when I discovered the truth, he expected me to stay quiet, forgive him, and help rebuild everything from nothing. What he did not understand was that I was no longer the patient wife he had spent years manipulating. By the time Daniel realized I was not going to protect him, it was already too late. My name is Emily Carter. I was 34 years old when my marriage collapsed. Although the collapse had probably started years before I noticed the first crack. Daniel and I had been married for almost 8 years. We were not wealthy, but we had good jobs, lived carefully, and saved more aggressively than most couples we knew. Our goal was simple. We wanted to buy a larger home in a quiet neighborhood, pay off the mortgage early, and eventually have children. Every month, I transferred a large portion of my salary into our joint savings account. I packed my lunch, drove an old car, avoided expensive vacations, and turned down countless little luxuries. Daniel told me he was doing the same. Whenever I felt tired or frustrated, he reminded me that we were building a future together. On weekends, we would sit on the couch and look through property listings. Daniel always chose houses with large kitchens and fenced backyards. He would point at the photographs and describe where our children might play, where we could host Thanksgiving, and where his mother could stay when she visited. I believed him. I believed the smile on his face, the warmth in his voice, and the promises he repeated so often that they became part of my identity. I did not think of myself as Emily, the woman who worked too many hours and rarely spent money on herself. I thought of myself as Emily, the woman building a secure life with the man she loved. Daniel's mother, Linda, had never been enthusiastic about our marriage. From the first day we met, she treated me like an unwanted guest in a family I had somehow invaded. She rarely insulted me directly. Linda was far too skilled for that. Instead, she made comments that sounded polite but left behind a sharp little wound. If I worked late, she said, career women have such complicated priorities. If I cooked dinner, she thanked Daniel for finding a wife who understood basic responsibility. If he bought me flowers, she reminded him that his mother had sacrificed far more for him than any wife ever would. Daniel always defended her in the same way. He said she was lonely. He said she had suffered after his father left. He said she did not mean anything by her remarks. For years, I accepted those explanations. I invited Linda to holidays, remembered her birthday, sent gifts, and tolerated her constant criticism. I told myself that difficult mothers-in-law were common and that maintaining peace was part of being an adult. What mattered, I thought, was that Daniel and I were united. That belief ended on an ordinary Tuesday morning. We had scheduled an appointment with a mortgage advisor for 3 o'clock that afternoon. I had taken the day off work so I could organize our financial documents. Daniel kissed my forehead before leaving and told me he would meet me at the bank. He seemed cheerful, almost excited. I think this is finally our year, he said. Those words stayed with me because, looking back, I still do not understand how he said them without shame. Around noon, I logged into our joint bank account to download several statements. The page loaded, and for a moment, I thought I had opened the wrong account. The balance showed $412. 3 days earlier, Our savings had contained more than $218,000. I refreshed the page. The number did not change. I logged out, logged back in, and checked again. Then I opened the transaction history. There was one enormous transfer. $217,643 had been sent 4 days earlier. The recipient was Linda Carter. My hands began to shake. At first, my mind searched desperately for an innocent explanation. Perhaps the bank had made an error. Perhaps someone had stolen our information. Perhaps Daniel had moved the money temporarily into an investment account. None of those possibilities made sense. But betrayal is difficult to accept when it arrives without warning. I called Daniel immediately. He answered in a relaxed voice, as though it were an ordinary afternoon. "Hey, Baba. Everything okay? Why is our savings account empty?" I asked. He did not sound confused. He did not ask what I meant. He simply became silent. Finally, he sighed. "I was hoping we could discuss that tonight." That sentence told me everything. "You already know." "I can explain." "Then explain now." Another pause followed. "Mom needed help." I stared at the computer screen. "You gave your mother more than $200,000 without telling me? It is not as simple as that." "What part is complicated?" "Daniel, the money was there. Now it is in your mother's account. She was in trouble. So you emptied our savings? She is my mother, Emily. And I am your wife." "I know that." "No. You do not. If you knew that, you would not have stolen from me." His tone changed immediately. "Do not use that word." "What word would you prefer?" "It was our money." "Then why did you make the decision alone?" He exhaled sharply, already irritated by my refusal to make the conversation easier for him. "I knew you would not understand." That was the moment something inside me became very still. He had not forgotten to tell me. He had not panicked during an emergency. He had deliberately excluded me because he believed my opinion did not matter. I ended the call and sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour. The room looked exactly the same. But the house no longer felt familiar. Every object reminded me of a shared life that might never have existed. The refrigerator we had chosen together. The photographs from our wedding. The folders containing plans for a future home. Suddenly, all of it felt like scenery on a stage. Then another thought occurred to me. The transfer should have required verification from both account holders. Daniel did not know my password. Or at least I had never given it to him. That meant he had watched me enter it, copied it, or accessed my personal information without permission. The transfer was not spontaneous. It had been planned. I began checking every financial account connected to our names. Credit cards, investment accounts, retirement contribution, insurance records, and tax documents. The more I searched, the worse the situation became. Over the previous 3 years, Daniel had made dozens of smaller transfers to Linda. $500 here, $2,000 there, sometimes $7,000 or $8,000 at once. Together, those payments totaled almost $38,000. He had hidden them by describing them as household expenses, repairs, or temporary loans. I was not looking at one terrible mistake. I was looking at a secret financial relationship that had existed for years. Daniel came home shortly after 6. He entered the kitchen cautiously, carrying flowers from the grocery store. The sight of them almost made me laugh. He placed them on the counter and tried to touch my shoulder. But I stepped away. "Where is the money?" I asked. He lowered his hand. "I told you. Mom needed it." "For what? She had debts?" "What kind of debts? Personal debts." "That is not an answer." He walked to the refrigerator. opened it, and stared inside without taking anything. Her house was at risk. Linda's house was fully paid off. I knew that because she mentioned it constantly, especially when criticizing our decision to rent. Her house has no mortgage. She borrowed against it. Why? Daniel shut the refrigerator. She made some bad investments. What investments? His eyes moved away from mine. I do not know all the details. That was another lie. I could hear it in the way his voice became softer. Daniel had always lowered his voice when he wanted to appear reasonable. You transferred our entire savings without knowing the details? She was desperate. Did she ask for all of it? He did not answer. Danielle, did your mother ask you to empty our account? She said she needed around $200,000. And you just gave it to her? She promised to pay us back. When? When she can. I stared at him. So there is no repayment date. She is family. That is not a repayment plan. He suddenly raised his voice. What was I supposed to do? Let my mother lose everything? Yes, I said calmly. If saving her required stealing everything from your wife. His expression hardened. You are being selfish. The word almost impressed me. He had taken years of my savings, destroyed our plans, lied repeatedly, and somehow I was selfish. I asked him to show me the loan agreement. He said there was none. I asked for copies of Linda's debts. He claimed he had not seen them. I asked whether she had contacted a financial advisor, sold unnecessary assets, or considered moving to a smaller home. Daniel called those questions cruel. Then he made the mistake that changed my anger into strategy. You will calm down, he said. We can rebuild the savings. You make good money. Not we. I. At that moment, I understood what he expected. He believed I would continue working, continue sacrificing, and replace the money he had given away. He expected me to remain silent because admitting the truth would embarrass him and his mother. He thought my sense of responsibility would become the weapon used against me. I looked at him and said, You are right. I need time to calm down. The relief on his face was immediate. He thought he had won. That night, Daniel slept in the guest room. I remained awake until nearly dawn. Not crying, not shouting, but making a list. The next morning, I called a family law attorney named Rebecca Shaw. I explained what had happened and brought every document I could find to her office. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked whether I wanted to save my marriage. No, I said. The answer surprised me with its certainty. I want to save whatever is left of my life. She explained that transferring marital assets to a relative without the other spouse's knowledge could be treated as dissipation of marital property. It did not guarantee that the money would be recovered, but it meant Daniel might be held financially responsible during the divorce. She warned me not to threaten him, destroy property, access accounts illegally, or move joint funds without documentation. The best revenge, she said, was often careful preparation. I followed her advice precisely. First, I opened a new account at a different bank and redirected my salary. I removed Daniel as an authorized user from my personal credit card and froze my credit. I copied every statement showing transfers to Linda. I saved emails, tax records, screenshots, and property documents. I changed the passwords to my personal accounts and moved important papers to a secure location. Then I returned home and behaved almost normally. For the next 2 weeks, Daniel believed I was considering forgiveness. He became unusually attentive. He cooked dinner, cleaned the kitchen, and sent apologetic messages during the day. He also repeated the same explanation whenever I asked about the money. Linda had made a bad investment. Her house was in danger. She would repay us eventually. He could not provide a single document proving any of it. Linda called me on the third day. Her voice was sweet, which immediately made me suspicious. Emily, I understand you are upset. Do you? Daniel told me you are having difficulty seeing the larger picture. The larger picture is that you received more than $200,000 from our account. She sighed dramatically. Family helps family. Then why did both of you hide it from me? We knew you might react emotionally. I nearly admired the arrogance. What did you do with the money? That is between Daniel and me. No. Linda. The money came from an account containing my salary. It is absolutely between you and me. Her voice became colder. You have always cared too much about money. I thought of every meal I had packed, every trip I had skipped, every extra hour I had worked. And you have always cared too little about money that belongs to someone else. She ended the call. That conversation gave Rebecca an idea. She advised me to communicate with Linda only in writing whenever possible. The next day, I sent a calm email asking her to confirm the amount she had received, the purpose of the transfer, and her plan for repayment. Linda did not answer directly. Instead, she replied that Daniel had given her a gift and that no repayment was required. That email was the first major break in the case. Daniel had told me the money was a loan. Linda had now called it a gift. When I showed him the message, he became pale. She used the wrong word. Did she? She is stressed. Then ask her to correct it. He promised he would. She never did. A week later, I discovered the real reason Linda wanted the money. Rebecca had hired a forensic accountant to examine the available records. Linda had not lost her house. She had not made a failed investment. 6 months earlier, she had agreed to purchase a luxury property in Florida with Daniel's older sister, Melissa. The house had a swimming pool, private dock, and ocean access. Linda planned to sell her current home, move south, and live there with Melissa's family. The money from our savings had been used for the down payment and closing costs. The discovery was painful, but it also clarified everything. Linda had not needed rescue. She wanted an upgrade. Daniel had not saved his mother from disaster. He had financed her retirement using my future. There was more. Melissa had known exactly where the money came from. In a message obtained during the legal process, she had written to Daniel, "Emily will be angry for a while, but she always gives in. Just remind her that Mom comes first." Daniel's response was worse. "She will get over it. She wants kids. So she will not leave." I read that sentence 3 times. He had used my dream of becoming a mother as proof that I could be controlled. That evening, I sat across from Daniel at our dining table and pretended I knew nothing about Florida. "I want to understand your side," I said. "Tell me again why your mother needed the money." He looked relieved. "Her home was at risk because of investment losses. And she plans to pay us back?" "Yes." "You are certain?" "Absolutely." I nodded slowly. "Good. Then there should be no problem signing a repayment agreement." His face changed. "What agreement?" "A document confirming that Linda owes us the full amount." "That seems unnecessary." "It is necessary to me. She will feel insulted." I felt insulted when my account was emptied. He stood up and began pacing. "You said you wanted to move forward." "I do. This is how." For 20 minutes, he argued. He called the agreement hostile, humiliating, and disrespectful. I remained calm. Finally, I said, "Then ask her to return the money." "She cannot." "Because she bought a house in Florida?" Daniel stopped moving. Silence filled the room. I placed copies of the property records on the table. Beside them, I placed Linda's email calling the transfer a gift and the messages between Daniel and Melissa. He stared at the documents as though they had appeared by magic. How did you get these? That is your first question? You invaded my privacy. You stole my savings. I did not steal anything. You lied about an emergency. Your mother used our money to buy a luxury property. And you told your sister I would stay because I wanted children. He reached for the messages. But I pulled them back. These are copies. His face became red. You have been investigating me. Yes. All this time. You were pretending we could fix things. No. Daniel. All this time. You were pretending there was something left to fix. I handed him an envelope containing divorce papers, for the first time since I had known him. Daniel had nothing to say. He opened the envelope. Read the first page. And looked at me in disbelief. You are divorcing me over money? I am divorcing you because you planned my life without my consent. Lied to me for years. And treated my work as a resource your family could take whenever they wanted. We can recover from this. You can. I already have. He laughed nervously. You are not thinking clearly. I have never thought more clearly. Then I told him I had already moved my salary, secured my credit, copied the financial records, and notified the bank that the transfer was disputed. I also told him that my attorney would seek reimbursement for my share of the dissipated assets. His confidence disappeared. You cannot take money from me that I do not have. That is a problem you should discuss with your mother. He called Linda immediately. He did not even wait until I left the room. I heard him explain that the divorce could force him to repay a large portion of the money. At first, Linda sounded shocked. Then she became furious. Her voice was loud enough for me to hear through the phone. She cannot do this to us. Daniel looked at me as though I were the enemy. She is serious. Mom, tell her she will get nothing. I smiled, picked up my bag, and left. I stayed with my friend Rachel while Daniel remained in the house. Over the following weeks, he sent messages that shifted from apology to anger, then back to apology. He offered counseling. He promised to cut contact with his mother. He claimed he had been manipulated. When those approaches failed, he accused me of destroying the family. Linda was less subtle. She sent long emails calling me greedy, vindictive, and heartless. She wrote that a good wife would have understood a son's duty to his mother. She also insisted the money was a voluntary gift from Daniel, even though half of it had come from my earnings. Every angry message became evidence. The Florida property created a major legal problem for Linda. Because the disputed funds could be traced directly to the purchase, Rebecca sought an order preventing the property from being sold or transferred while the case continued. Linda and Melissa had planned to renovate the house and move in before winter. Instead, the property became tied to a legal dispute. That was when the family turned against Daniel. Melissa called him irresponsible for involving her in his marriage. Linda demanded that he convince me to withdraw the claim. Daniel, who had sacrificed our marriage to gain his mother's approval, discovered that her affection disappeared the moment he became inconvenient. He began calling me almost every night. Please, he said during one conversation, drop the claim against the house. Mom is not sleeping. I did not sleep when I discovered our savings were gone. She is 63 years old, and I spent 6 years saving that money. You are punishing everyone. No. I am asking everyone to return what they took. He became quiet. Then he said, What do you want? It was the question I had been waiting for. I want my share of the money returned. I want reimbursement for the hidden transfers. I want you to accept responsibility for the debt created by your decision. And I want the divorce completed without delay. That will ruin me. You should have considered that before you ruined our future. The legal process lasted nearly 10 months. During that time, the carefully united Carter family began tearing itself apart. Linda blamed Melissa for choosing an expensive property. Melissa blamed Daniel for taking money without securing my agreement. Daniel blamed Linda for pressuring him. Each of them insisted someone else was responsible. Eventually, they were forced to sell Linda's original home. Part of the proceeds went toward repaying the disputed funds. The Florida property was also sold before Linda ever moved into it. Because of legal costs, and a declining local market, they lost a significant amount on the transaction. Melissa's husband, who had not known the full story, separated from her. After discovering how deeply she had participated in the scheme, Daniel received the hardest financial consequences. In the divorce settlement, the court credited a substantial portion of the transferred money to his side of the marital assets. That meant I kept most of my retirement account, my personal savings, and the proceeds from selling our shared home. He also assumed responsibility for several debts he had concealed. The final mediation took place in a quiet conference room. Daniel sat across from me, looking older than he had 10 months earlier. Linda was not present, but her influence seemed to occupy the empty chair beside him. He signed the settlement slowly. When he finished, he looked at me and whispered, "Was all of this worth it?" I studied his face. Part of me remembered the man who had once sat beside me looking at houses. Part of me remembered our wedding day, our private jokes, and the future I had believed in. But memory is not the same as trust, and love cannot survive where respect has been deliberately destroyed. "I did not choose this," I said. "I chose what happened after you did." He lowered his eyes. 3 months after the divorce became final, I purchased a small house on my own. It was not the large family home Daniel and I had once imagined. The kitchen needed new cabinets. The yard was overgrown, and the guest room had terrible wallpaper. But every key belonged to me. Every payment came from an account no one else could access. For the first time in years, my future felt uncertain in a way that was exciting rather than frightening. I later heard that Daniel moved into a small apartment and stopped speaking to Melissa. His relationship with Linda became complicated after she blamed him for losing both houses. She had received more than $200,000 from her son and still managed to present herself as the victim. Daniel eventually admitted to a mutual friend that he had expected me to forgive him because I had forgiven so many smaller things before. That confession stayed with me. People often think betrayal begins with one dramatic event. Usually, it begins much earlier. It begins the first time someone ignores your boundaries and watches to see whether you will object. It grows every time your discomfort is dismissed, every time you are told to be patient, and every time keeping the peace becomes more important than protecting yourself. Daniel did not wake up one morning and suddenly decide my opinion did not matter. He had been learning that lesson for years. Because I had repeatedly accepted behavior that hurt me, I used to regret not confronting him sooner. Now, I understand that regret is not useful unless it teaches you something. I learned that trust without verification can become vulnerability. I learned that love does not require unlimited forgiveness. Most importantly, I learned that revenge does not have to mean shouting. Humiliation or destruction. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to absorb the consequences of someone else's choices. Daniel expected me to work for another 6 years and replace the money he gave away. Linda expected to enjoy a luxury home purchased with my sacrifices. Melissa expected me to remain quiet because she believed my desire for a family made me weak. Instead, they lost the house, the money, and the relationships they had tried to protect through deception. I did not need to destroy them. I only stopped protecting them from the truth. A year after buying my house, I stood in the backyard one evening and looked at the small garden I had planted. The sun was setting behind the fence, and the first flowers were beginning to open. For a moment, I thought about the backyard Daniel once promised our children would play in. The memory still hurt, but it no longer controlled me. My future had not disappeared when the money vanished. It had simply changed shape. I had spent years believing that starting over would mean failure. Instead, starting over became the first honest decision I had made in a very long time. The house was smaller than the one I had dreamed about, but it was peaceful. My bank account was not as large as it had once been, but it was secure. My marriage was over. But so was the fear of discovering another lie. Daniel gave our savings to his mother because he believed I would never leave. He thought my patience was weakness. My loyalty was permanent, and my dreams could be used to control me. He was wrong, and by the time he understood just how wrong he had been,